The Expectation Effect by David Robson, Chapter 10, The Superagers. Why you really are as young or old as you feel. For over a decade, Patty Jones has been wowing audiences across the world with her spicy salsa dancing. She came to fame on the Spanish talent show Tu Si Que Vales, You're Worth It, in 2009 and has since found success in the UK through Britain's Got Talent, in Germany on Das Supertalent, in Argentina on the dancing show Ballando, and in Italy where she performed at the Sanremo Music Festival in 2018 alongside the band La Stato Social. Jones also happens to be in her mid-80s, making her the world's oldest acrobatic salsa dancer according to Guinness World Records. Growing up in the UK, Jones has been a keen dancer and had performed professionally before she married her husband David at 22 and had 4 children. In retirement, the pair moved to Spain, and it was the tragedy of her husband's death from cancer that spurred her to take dance lessons. After trying all kinds of Latin American styles, she soon fell in love with acrobatic salsa, during which she is frequently thrown into the air by her dance partner Nika. I don't plead my age because I don't feel 80 or act it, Jones told the media in 2014. She will only stop dancing, she has said, when Nico, 40 years her junior, gets tired. We have seen the many ways in which our expectations can powerfully influence our mental and physical well-being, altering our perception, our biological responses to diet, exercise, and stress, and our cognitive abilities. And now I want to show you how all these expectation effects may powerfully converge to change the way we age. The fact that your beliefs could add or subtract years from your life is, in my opinion, the most striking and important consequence of this new understanding of the brain's prediction machine, and the reason I believe that the mind-body connection needs to be taken so seriously. Before we continue, please give honest answers to the following 4 questions. Do things get better or worse, or stay the same as you get older? In each pair of the following words, which one do you associate with retirement and beyond? Uninvolved or involved, unable or able, dependent or independent, idle or busy. When does middle age end and old age begin? Based purely on your subjective experience rather than your actual chronological age, how old do you feel today? As we shall see, your responses to these and similar questions may be as or more important for your future health as your current health status. Indeed, many scientists are coming to the conclusion that your beliefs about the aging process may be as important for your long-term well-being as your actual age. Through multiple pathways, your expectations set the speed of your cell's biological clocks, determining everything from trivial aches and pains to your risk of heart disease, dementia, and death. The youthful mindset of someone like Patty Jones, it turns out, a kind of illicit of youth. If you could turn back time. The first hints that our thoughts and expectations could either accelerate or decelerate the aging process came from a remarkable experiment by the psychologist Ellen Langer at Harvard University. Langer is known for being something of a maverick researcher. She was one of the first to examine the benefits of mindfulness long before the subject became a fashionable object of scientific study. She was also the researcher who examined the ways that expectation can influence eyesight. See Chapter 1. In 1979, Langer decided to investigate the mind-body connection by asking a group of 70 and 80-year-olds to pretend that they were living in the year 1959 again. The participants were recruited through local newspaper adverts. First, they were given various tests that would normally be used to diagnose age-related problems, and then they were asked to perform a memory test alongside other cognitive tasks, such as finding their way through pencil and paper mazes, that were designed to measure the speed of the brain's processing, which is commonly assumed to slow down in old age. Linger's team also tested the participants' eyesight and hearing and the flexibility of their joints. The researchers then brought the participants to a week-long retreat at a monastery in Peterborough, New Hampshire, which had been redecorated to look as if it had been stuck in a time warp from the late 1950s. Everything from the magazines in the living room to the music playing on the radio, such as the crooning of Perry Como, Nat King Cole, and Rosemary Clooney, and the films available to watch, Some Like It Hot, North by Northwest, and Ben-Hur, was carefully chosen for historical accuracy. To ensure that the environment changed the participants' mindsets, the researchers also asked them to write a biography of themselves for that era in the present tense, and gave them explicit instructions to live as if it were 1959, without discussing anything that had occurred since that point. Instead, the participants were encouraged to discuss the politics and the sporting events of 2 decades previously. The aim was to evoke their younger and fitter selves through all these associations. To create a comparison, the researchers ran a second retreat a week later. While factors like the decor, diet, and social contact remained the same, these participants were asked to reminisce about the past without actually acting as if they were younger. When they wrote a biography describing their lives, they did so in the past tense, for instance, rather than the present. A seemingly small difference that meant their mindset was still focused on their current age. Most of the participants showed some improvements from the baseline battery of tests to the after-retreat ones, but it was those in the first group who had more fully immersed themselves in the world of 1959 who saw the greatest benefits. 63% made a significant gain on their cognitive tests, for example, compared to just 44% in the control condition. Their vision became sharper, their joints more flexible, and their hands more dexterous, as some of the inflammation from their arthritis receded. The change was even noticeable in their appearance. As their posture improved, they became taller and walked more easily. Linger took photos of the participants before and after the retreat. Observers who were not told about the purpose of the experiment rated the second pictures as looking considerably younger than the first. It was as if she had actually turned the clocks back. As enticing as these findings might seem, Linger's experiment suffered from the same flaws as some of the other early mindset studies, and indeed, much other psychological research from that era. Most serious was the size of the sample. There were just 8 members in the immersive group and 8 in the control group, which is not typically considered to be large enough to draw general conclusions about the population as a whole. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence, after all, and the idea that our mindset could somehow influence our physical aging is about as extraordinary as scientific theories come. Becca Levy at the Yale School of Public Health has been leading the way to provide sufficient evidence to support the astonishing claim. In one of her earliest and most eye-catching papers, she examined data from the Ohio Longitudinal Study of Aging and Retirement. The founders of the study had selected more than 1,100 participants who had turned 50 by the 1st of July 1975, and then followed their progress over the subsequent decades. The participants had also been asked at the study start to rate their agreement with statements such as, "I have as much pep as I did last year. As you get older, you are less useful. Things keep getting worse as I get older." Based on these scores, Levy's team divided the participants into 2 groups, those with a positive perception of their own aging and those with a negative self-perception of aging, and examined the risk of mortality in each case. She found the average person with a more positive attitude to aging lived on for 22.6 years after the study commenced, while the average person with poorer perceptions of aging survived for just 15 years, a difference of around 7.5 years. This link remained even when other known risk factors such as their socioeconomic status or their feelings of loneliness had been taken into account. The implications of the findings are as remarkable today as they were in 2002 when the study was first published. If a previously unidentified virus was found to diminish life expectancy by over 7 years, considerable effort would probably be devoted to identifying the cause and implementing a remedy. Levy and her team wrote in their paper, "In the present case, one of the likely causes is known: societality sanctioned denigration of the aged." Later studies have since reinforced the link between people's expectations and their physical aging, while dismissing some of the more obvious and less interesting explanations. You might expect that people's attitudes would reflect their decline rather than contribute to the degeneration, for example. Yet that can't fully explain the most eye-catching results. Levy looked at the Baltimore longitudinal study of aging, for instance, which had followed the progress of hundreds of people from the late 1950s to the early 21st century. Beginning in 1968, the participants were questioned about their attitudes to old age, such as their level of agreement with the statement, "Old people are helpless." With an average of 36, it is unlikely that most of the participants would have started to suffer serious age-related disabilities. Their opinions of aging were much more likely to have come from the culture around them than any personal experience. And Levy found that those views could predict their subsequent risk of illnesses such as angina, congestive heart failures, myocardial infarctions, and strokes up to 38 years later, even when she controlled for pre-existing factors such as obesity, smoking habits, or family history of cardiovascular disease. Positive attitudes to aging even seem to protect us from certain kinds of dementia. Although the precise causes of Alzheimer's disease are still being researched, we know many of the neurological changes that accompany the illness, including the buildup of a protein called beta amyloid between cells. As these clumps, named plaques, accumulate, they destroy the synapses that are essential for brain signaling. Patients with Alzheimer's also develop tangles of another protein, tau, within the brain cells themselves. We now know that certain gene variants, most notably APOE4, can render you more vulnerable to the disease. But those inherited differences do not seal your fate. Many people with APOE4 never develop dementia. To find out whether your attitude to aging might change the odds of being struck with the disease, Levy looked again at the medical records of the people within the long-term cohort studies that had measured people's attitudes to aging, one of which had fortuitously included regular MRI scans during the study and brain autopsies after death. She found that people's expectations became inscribed all over their brain, with a markedly increased accumulation of the beta amyloid plaques and tau protein tangles among those who had previously shown a negative view of aging. These people also showed pronounced damage to the hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped region deep in the brain that is responsible for memory formation. A follow-up study found that the effects of attitudes toward aging were particularly pronounced among the people carrying the high-risk 4 variant of the APOE gene. For them, positive expectations of aging have the risk of developing dementia compared with people carrying the high-risk variant who assume that aging came with a mental and physical decline. Indeed, among people with positive expectations of aging, the high-risk variant of the gene barely seems to increase the risk of dementia at all. It would be hard to overestimate the importance of these findings. So much has been said about purely biological risk factors that can accelerate the progression of disease as we get older. Yet, according to this research, our own thoughts are equally, if not more, potent. High blood cholesterol levels, for example, are thought to reduce the average life expectancy by up to 4 years, much less than the 7.5-year reduction caused by taking a dim view of our future health. Like any medical risk, the personal danger to ourselves of a negative attitude to aging will depend on many different factors. Even the simple question of how you define old can determine the size of the effects. According to a seminal study of Whitehall civil servants working for the UK government. The Whitehall studies are most famous for showing that social status can affect our health, revealing that people on the lower rungs have a much greater health burden than those at the top of the competitive hierarchy. But in the early 1990s, the civil servants were asked to define when middle age ended and old age began, and it turned out that the earlier they saw the onset of old age, the more likely they were to experience declining health at a younger age themselves. Over the following decade, people who believed that old age began at 60 or younger were around 40% more likely to develop coronary heart disease than those who believed that middle age finished at 70 or older. In other words, it seems that you may be able to escape some of the effects by deciding that you haven't yet reached the relevant age bracket. This brings us to the fourth and final question on page 205, in which I asked you to estimate your subjective age, how old you feel inside, as opposed to your actual chronological age. The idea that you're as young as you feel is something of a cliche, but studies examining thousands of participants have shown that people with a lower subjective age tend to enjoy greater physical and mental health. How could this be? One possible answer is that the lower subjective age leads you to think that you are the exception to the normal decline that you expect in other people. This belief allows you to retain more positive expectations of your health as the years go by, shielding you from the damaging effects of the negative stereotypes that are normally so influential. This essentially is what Langer was trying to achieve in her time warp study way back in 1979. In the monastery set up to replicate the decor and culture of the late 1950s, she hoped to turn back the participants' subjective ages by 20 years. When they had entered the house, they still felt like elderly people in their 70s and 80s, with all the perceived burden that this entailed. By then, however, they left the monastery with a reinvigorated sense of themselves as 50 and 60 years old. Ages when they had more energy and a greater sense of purpose in their lives, and at least for that small sample of participants, it seemed to have worked. Mentally, and to a lesser but still significant extent, physically, they appeared to have temporarily turned back the clocks. Stereotype embodiment theory. Where do our negative expectations come from, and how do they wield such power over our well-being? To answer these questions, we need to understand a process known as stereotype embodiment. The writer Martin Amis provides a useful illustration. If the dancer Patty Jones represents the optimum attitude to aging, then Amis offers us the polar opposite. In an interview in 2010, he decreed the silver tsunami of the aging population. There will be a population of demented, very old people, like an invasion of terrible immigrants, stinking out the restaurants and cafes and shops, he said. I can imagine a sort of civil war between the old and the young in 10 or 15 years' time. He flippantly called for euthanasia booths on every street corner and at literary festivals. He described the aging process as starting in our own low-budget horror film, saving the worst to last. It is hard to imagine a harsher view of the elderly than to believe that death is preferable to healthy aging. As literary critics pointed out at the time, Amis's novels had long expressed fear and disgust of aging, filled as they are with negative stereotypes of older generations. The age of 20, he claimed in his first novel, represented the end of youth. And as Amis aged himself, he often became filled with fear about his own fate. Your youth evaporates in your early 40s when you look in the mirror, he told the Smithsonian Magazine, and then it becomes a full-time job pretending you're not going to die. In his 60s, he could already see his own talents dwindling, describing the loss of energy and musicality in his writing. The waterfall of creativity he had once felt was drying up. According to the scientific research, Amos's experience represents a common trajectory. We pick up our negative views of the old in youth when they are initially directed to other people. At a certain point, however, something changes in our own lives. We reach a milestone age, or we retire, or we go gray, leading us to realize the stereotypes now apply to us. At this point, we begin to live out a self-fulfilling prophecy as the stereotypes become embodied, precipitating our physical and cognitive decline. There are multiple simultaneous but potentially interconnected pathways to stereotype embodiment. The first is purely psychological. Consider the apparent loss of memory. When presented with negative stereotypes, older people tend to lose confidence in their mental abilities and prefer instead to rely on artificial crutches like shopping lists or the car GPS rather than committing things to memory. Yet research suggests that they can often remember far more than they suspect if they are forced to rely on their memory alone, and that making a concerted effort to exercise their minds should slow the decline. Problems with concentration can similarly arise from negative expectations. The more someone fears being distracted and proving the negative stereotype, the harder it is to actually focus. For many people, the shrinking attention span is an illusion that does not necessarily reflect a biological reality. Gerben Westerhoff at the University of Twente in the Netherlands has shown that something as inconsequential as viewing an ageist TV advert can have these effects on people's thinking. Seeing an older adult acting incompetently leads older viewers to suffer from impaired cognition. Such expectation effects may start out being temporary, but over time they could become ingrained, leading to more permanent decline. The second pathway is behavioral and motivational. If we assume that our body is set to become feeble and weak, and we see our environment as being more daunting than it really is, we will be discouraged from hard exercise and may find any exercise we do engage in as much more physically tiring, thanks to our negative expectations. Even everyday movements like walking pace become slower and less energetic when people are expecting a steep decline. This may explain why Levy has found a strong correlation between people's attitudes to aging and their risk of obesity as they get older. Thirdly, and finally, we have the psychosomatic route to becoming the stereotype we fear. Our expectations of frailty can amplify the body's aches and pains, or increase feelings like nausea and dizziness, a nocebo response that could contribute to the general perception of feeling unwell that many older people report. Through changes to our respiration and metabolism, physical activity may actually become more difficult. We have seen, after all, how people who take a dim view of their own fitness tend to have a harder time exercising and are less likely to gain so much benefit from it afterwards. Even more importantly, our negative expectations may provoke an unhealthy stress response with far-reaching effects on our long-term health. Remember that the prediction machine carefully weighs up our abilities to respond to a new threat or challenge and uses these calculations to calibrate the release of hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol, which prepare us to deal with an immediate threat at the expense of long-term health. And DHEAS, which is involved in tissue maintenance and repair, which is released in greater quantities when we see an event as a positive challenge. The prediction machine also controls the cardiovascular response, determining whether our vessels constrict to prevent blood loss in the face of a threat, or dilate to allow the brain and limbs to become oxygenated, allowing us to rise to a challenge. and whether you need to preserve energy or whether you can release your stores to confront the situation. If you consider yourself to be weaker, dimmer, and more vulnerable as a result of your age, you would be more likely to see a difficulty as a negative threat rather than a positive challenge, resulting in the more damaging stress responses that could wreak havoc on the body over time. This has been apparent in laboratory experiments. Elderly people who have been primed with negative age stereotypes tend to have higher systolic blood pressure in response to stressful challenges, while those who have seen positive stereotypes demonstrate a more muted reaction. In the long term, Levy has found that people's cortisol levels steadily rise by roughly 40% from people's 50th to 80th birthdays if they have negative attitudes to aging. Those with positive views, in contrast, show a 10% decrease in cortisol over the same period as they settle into the next stage of their life. That chronic stress response can then trigger chronic inflammation, which causes general wear and tear on our tissues and is a known contributor to various illnesses, including arthritis, heart disease, and Alzheimer's. Sure enough, one of Levy's recent studies found that negative attitudes to aging could predict heightened inflammation 4 years later, which in turn contributed to an increased risk of death over the following 2 years. The consequences of our negative expectations can even be seen within the nuclei of the individual cells, where our genetic blueprint is stored. Our genes are wrapped tightly in each cell's chromosomes, which have tiny protective caps called telomeres that keep the DNA stable and stop it from becoming frayed and damaged. For this reason, telomeres are often compared to agelets, the plastic tips at the end of shoelaces. A comparison that may be technically apt, but nevertheless lacks a certain poetry, given just how important our telomeres are to our survival. At birth, our telomeres are long and strong, but they can be worn down by chronic stress and become shorter over our lifespan. Shorter telomeres reduce the cell's capacity to replicate without error, and without a long enough telomere, a cell may be unable to divide at all. The length of our telomeres can vary between people of the same chronological age, depending on the lifestyle factors, including inflammation and stress, and this does seem to predict people's longevity and risk of disease. Levy's stereotype embodiment theory would predict that people with negative expectations of aging should have shorter telomeres, and they do. Through things like stress and inflammation, our attitudes to aging can also affect the expression of the individual genes tucked inside those chromosomes. Within each cell, we have small attachments to the DNA that can either turn on or turn off individual genes. This light switching determines which proteins the cell produces and ultimately how it functions. Certain patterns of activation or deactivation become more prevalent as we age and may explain many of the changes associated with old age, including our increased vulnerability to diseases. Importantly, people with negative attitudes to old age demonstrate more of these characteristic age-related changes, while people with more positive attitudes have a slower epigenetic clock. Levy speculates that this may explain why people with the positive view of aging seem to be less vulnerable to dementia, even if they carry the higher risk variant of the APOE gene, where stress may lead to epigenetics changes that heighten the gene's effects in the people with the negative views, increasing their vulnerability to the disease, whereas it may be muted in the people who have more positive expectations of the aging process. Some of these changes may be reversible. We know that an enzyme called telomerase can help to repair the caps at the ends of our chromosomes, and activating that enzyme seems to reverse some of the effects of premature aging. Perhaps in the future we will find drugs that prevent our cells from gathering any wear and tear. For now, it seems certain that we can at least show our decline by living a healthier lifestyle and by changing our expectations of what it means to be old. Age ain't nothing but a number. If we want to reappraise the true limits that come with age, let's first meet some more people who, like Patty Jones, have confounded society's ageist expectations of what we can achieve later in life. Take Hiromu Inada from Chiba in Japan. He started swimming, running, and cycling 18 years ago and entered his first triathlon a year later. The sport became something of an obsession, and he eventually graduated to the Hawaii Ironman event in Kalakona, an extreme endurance competition that requires the entrants to swim 3.86 kilometers, 2.4 miles, cycle 180.25 kilometers, 112 miles, and then run a full 42 kilometers, 26.2 miles, marathon. To be able to do so, Inada has developed a ruthless training schedule. He wakes up at 4:30 each morning and hits the gym at 6 a.m. His training often continues until after sunset, and he only takes one day off each week. By 2020, Inada had completed the Ironman 3 times, with finishing times that hover around 16 hours and 50 minutes. Simply making it to the finishing line of an Ironman tournament would be a remarkable achievement for most people of any age. But Inada only began his training when he retired from his job as a news reporter in his 60s. He competed in his first Olympic distance triathlon a few years later and only began competing in the Ironman events when he was in his early 80s. His latest record came in 2018, a little over a month away from his 86th birthday. As the work on subjective aging would predict, Inada has maintained a youthful outlook, and he does not view age as a barrier to extraordinary achievement. He says that even at 70, he felt very young, and his training has helped to stave off a decline since then. Equally impressive as the Swiss runner Albert Stricker, who completed an ultra-marathon in Basel in Switzerland at the age of 95. Like Inada, he only started his sport after retirement, aged 65, and only ran his first full marathon, aged 90. His training consists of 5 to 10 kilometer runs every weekday. The aim in the Basel event was to run as far as you could for 12 hours solid. Stricker covered around 53 kilometers, 33 miles in total. You may imagine that this kind of exertion would cause serious bodily damage to someone of this age, but medical tests by B. Knetchel at the Institute of Primary Care, University of Zurich, revealed that Stricker had completely recovered from the event within 5 days. It's fair to say that Jones, Inada, and Stricker will not be troubling the records of elite younger athletes anytime soon. All other things being equal, younger people will have a physical advantage. But this trio nevertheless demonstrates that an extraordinarily high level of fitness, even extreme endurance, can be achieved later into life. Knetchel's analysis of male ultramarathon runners found that there's around an 8% drop in performance for each decade lived. And even that decline may be falling as older athletes become more competitive and find better ways to train. In the 1980s, for example, the 60 to 64-year-olds were competing at around 60% capacity of the under 40s in Ironman tournaments. Now it's more than 70%. The truth is, we still don't know how well we can preserve our fitness into old age, since so few have tried to push their bodies to these limits. But we have more than enough evidence to show that our potential as we age is much greater than is commonly believed. These patterns match studies of less extreme exercisers, which show that, when treated correctly, and if you adopt the right lifestyle and the right mindset, the human body can be much more resilient to the passage of time than most of us imagine. As we appraise the cognitive effects of aging, we should remember the astonishing bursts of creativity shown by certain artists as they reach the average retirement age. Consider Penelope Fitzgerald. Having worked in various jobs, including teaching, she published her first novel at the age of 60 and won the Booker Prize 2 years later. At the age of 80, she won the U.S. National Book Critics Circle Award for her final novel, The Blue Flower, a book often considered to be her masterpiece. You can see her becoming a better writer as she aged, wrote the New York critic James Wood. More serious and expansive, more confident and supple. It's hardly the creative drought that Martin Amis has described. In the visual arts, Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse both found renewed inspiration towards the ends of their lives. At around the age of 60, Picasso turned to ceramics, creating more than 3,500 works that fused paintings, printmaking, and sculpture. Matisse, meanwhile, picked up scissors and paper to produce his astonishing cutouts, which he described as carving into color. They remain some of his most celebrated works. These extraordinary stories are all worth bearing in mind, since the simple recognition of our capacity to control our aging, be it through mindset or lifestyle changes, can itself provide a kind of counter charm against the negative stereotypes of getting older. Consider a study published in 2018 of 60 to 90-year-olds by David Wiss at Columbia University. He first tested whether his participants endorsed essentialist views, such as, to a large extent, a person's age biologically determines his or her abilities, or whether they consider aging to be a malleable process, endorsing statements such as, no matter at what point in life, you can always influence your own aging. Note that these beliefs in themselves do not necessarily reflect a good or bad view of aging, but simply whether the process is controllable. After they had completed the survey, Wiss asked the participants to take a quiz that consisted of questions about dementia and physical disability, an exercise designed to evoke the typical stereotypes of older people. Finally, he asked them to complete a memory test and measured the stress response. He found that the people who saw aging as a biological inevitability were far more likely to be affected by the negative stereotypes in the dementia quiz, showing greater stress and reduced performance in the memory test. That makes sense. If you assume that you have no control over your biology, then the thoughts of decline are going to be much scarier. The people who felt that they had more control over their fate showed the exact opposite response, however. They tended to do better on the test after being primed with all those thoughts of frailty and decline. Their feelings of empowerment had allowed them to prove themselves to be expectations to our pessimistic predictions of aging, and as a result, the challenge of confronting those negative stereotypes had actually energized their performance. You don't need to have the ambition to be an Ironman athlete, an award-winning novelist, or a prolific artist to understand that aging can be a far more exciting prospect than the doom and gloom depicted by the likes of Martin Amis. Their stories simply show us the extraordinary limits of what is possible. The way we age is very much within our power. The more we remember that fact, the easier we will find it to confront the negative expectations thrust on us by society and to choose our own path. As Hiromu Inada told the Japan Times in 2019, I hope everyone can see and be encouraged that you can do the same things as the younger generation. Elixirs of life. A broader recognition of these age-related expectation effects cannot come quickly enough. In 2015, there were around 901 million people aged 60 years and above, 12.3% of the global population. By 2030, that number will have risen to 1.4 billion, 16.4% of the global population. And by 2050, it will have increased to 2.1 billion, 21.3% of the global population at current rates of diagnosis. 152 million of those people may have dementia by the middle of this century. Doctors today often talk about the health span, those years lived without serious disability or illness, as opposed to the lifespan. The idea being that living a good life without illness is the true goal rather than simply extending the number of years you survive. But by raising our expectations of the aging process, we have the astounding possibility of adding years to both. It is little wonder these scientists have been investigating the best ways to apply this research on a large scale. As part of her continuing research on the effects of ageism, Levy invited elderly participants aged 61 and 99 to play a simple computer game, while positive age-related words such as wise, spry, and creative flashed briefly on the screen. Although the participants could not have perceived the words consciously, they must have absorbed the message, as Levy found that their attitudes towards aging improved significantly over the course of 4 weekly sessions. And this newfound optimism translated to a remarkable improvement in their physical well-being. They were more mobile, and their gait and posture had begun to resemble those of a younger person. Amazingly, these benefits gained from implicit messaging even surpassed the results of a physical exercise regimen that encouraged gentle activity 3 times a week for 6 months. Levy's experiment was an important proof of concept to demonstrate how powerful unconscious cues can be in changing people's expectations and the benefits that can bring. Given these results, some researchers have speculated that similar cues could be added to certain films or TV programs, such as messaging would have to contend with some people's discomfort at the idea of subliminal manipulation. For now, it may be more realistic to focus on conscious change without the idea of any hidden cues. The most exciting interventions combine education about aging stereotypes with other activities, like physical exercise, which allow people to test their own abilities and gain some first-hand evidence of the ways that their expectations may have been limiting their lives. The benefits have been remarkable. Elderly residents of Los Angeles, for instance, were given weekly lessons on the physical potential of the aging body and brain, and on the ways that negative stereotypes might be holding them back, followed by an hour's gym class to reinforce the learning. After the lessons had finished, their mobility had increased tremendously, from 24,749 to 30,707 steps per week, a 24% increase according to the readings on their pedometers. Crucially, the physical benefits seem to follow changes to their attitudes to aging. The more positive their thinking, the more active they became. The participants also reported better day-to-day functioning and reduced pain from chronic conditions, like arthritis. These results have since been replicated many times with many populations. In some cases, the altered expectations were found to double the participants' physical activity long after the intervention had finished, with improvements above and beyond standard fitness regimens that had not deliberately targeted participants' expectations about aging. While it is hard to pick apart the precise reasons for such improvement, it seems likely that the intervention acted on all 3 elements of stereotype embodiment: the psychological, behavioral, and psychosomatic factors. The participants' positive expectations reduced age-related stress and improved the way they felt, physically and mentally, and this in turn meant that they became more likely to exercise. Ideally, these kinds of interventions will soon be provided by health services across the world. In the meantime, we can all start applying a bit of critical thinking to our own thoughts. If you feel that you may be too old for a certain activity, start questioning the foundations for that expectation. Does it arise from a real physical disability that you actually feel at this moment? Or have you been infected by the messages of others? And is it time to push yourself out of your comfort zone with a new activity you were once too scared to try? When it comes to our cognitive decline, there is now good evidence that learning new skills in middle and old age can help to maintain memory and concentration, and crucially build your confidence in our own abilities, reversing some of our more negative expectations and sparking a virtuous cycle. When I spoke to Patty Jones, she was careful to emphasize the potential role of luck in her good health, but she agrees that many people have needlessly pessimistic views of their capabilities over what could be their golden years, and encourages them to question those views. Since she came to fame, she has received many messages from people who have been inspired to take up new activities, and she hopes that others will follow their lead. If you feel that there's something that you want to do and it inspires you, try it. And if you find you can't do it, then look for something else that you can achieve. Reevaluating your attitudes to age and aging will be especially important when you face a serious life event like retirement. Patty Jones and the ultra endurance athletes Hiroma Inada and Albert Stricker all took up their sports after finishing their earlier careers. At a time when many people started thinking more pessimistically about their aging, they had found a way to challenge those attitudes and continually prove their own abilities, and we could all learn from their experiences, however grand or modest our own ambitions may be. An ageless society. In November 2019, I was lucky enough to visit the province of Nuoro on the east coast of Sardinia. Its rugged mountains rise steeply from the Mediterranean Sea, and its 200,000 inhabitants live in small villages and towns dotted throughout the valleys. Farming of goats and pigs is still the main way of living. In the past, Nuoro was most famous for being the birthplace of the Nobel Prize winning writer Grazia Deledda. Today, it is perhaps best known for having one of the highest concentrations of centenarians in the world. When adjusted for the size of the overall population, they have about 3 times as many people over 100 as the rest of Sardinia and 10 times as many as the USA. There are many scientific theories for their incredible longevity. Sardinia's population has been isolated for large periods of history and has a unique genetic profile as a result. As we've already seen, however, our genes cannot seal our fate. A study from 2018 found that just 7% of the differences can be attributed to our genes. There's also the diet, which is Spartan but nutritious and high in antioxidants that are known to prevent cellular damage, and exercise, with some farmers continuing to work into their 70s and 80s. Considering our knowledge of expectation effects and their power over our lives, however, I can't help but wonder whether a large part of the Sardinians' amazing lifespans is down to their culture, which holds great respect for their older members of the community. Dr. Rafael Sestu, a doctor in the small town of Arzana, certainly thinks so. He has worked with dozens of centenarians in his practice and says that most are treated with reverence as the head of the family well into their old age. Someone who knows they have a role and who believes in him or herself lives a better life and more easily lives longer than 100, he told me. Sadly, this attitude seems to be missing in many industrialized countries across the Americas, Europe, and Asia, where fewer people live in intergenerational households, and older people are more often treated as a burden rather than a valued member of the family. This mindset is a disadvantage for children and grandchildren as well as grandparents. Various studies show that regular contact with elders can lead younger people to develop more positive views of aging. As those children reach adulthood and middle age, those experiences will help them to remember what healthy aging can look like. People who do not have that regular contact, in contrast, are more easily swayed by the ageist stereotypes in the media. When you do not regularly see people of a certain demographic, it can be easy to either ridicule or disparage them. It is a sad irony that our medical care has been able to increase life expectancy, and yet, due to other social changes, we have come to view those resilient long livers as a nuisance rather than people to be cherished and respected. Places like Nuoro, where age is seen as a strength, might be much rarer today than they were in the past. but it needn't be this way. On a personal level, we might try to build bridges between generations, befriending people who are older and younger than us. But as a society, we need to go much further and tackle ageism, just as we do racism, homophobia, and other kinds of prejudice. Over time, we lazily use ageist stereotypes. We are effectively spreading a deadly pathogen that will, in time, come to hurt ourselves as much as others. When it comes to the expectation effects surrounding aging, we all have the choice to either perpetuate these toxic ideas or help to change them. And we need to act now. Our lives and those of the people we love may literally depend on it. How to think about aging. Rather than idealizing youthfulness, focus on all the things that you can gain from living a longer life, including experience, knowledge, and improved emotional regulation and decision making. Remember that many of the things that we typically associate with aging, such as physical weakness, are within our control and can be improved with a healthier lifestyle. Avoid attributing sickness to your age, since this will reinforce the idea of an inevitable decline. People with a positive view of aging tend to recover from illness more quickly than those with negative expectations. Look out for good role models, people like Patty Jones or Hiromu Inada, who have challenged today's expectations. Be aware of your media diet. Many films and TV series will reinforce offensive stereotypes about older people. Try to watch stories or documentaries that deal with aging more sensitively, or at least engage more critically with what you do watch. If you are young or middle-aged, befriend people outside of your own age group. The research shows that doing so alone can improve expectations of aging.